Welcome, everyone. I'm pleased to have you join us today. My name is Kate Charters. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the chair of the National Steering Committee for SEGRA, which is the acronym for Sustainable Economic Growth for Regional Australia. And I'm also the convener of the SEGRA conference, and this year the SEGRA conference is being conducted in Kalgoorlie-Boulder from the 16th to the 18th of November. So we're looking forward to seeing people there. I'd like to welcome you all to our webinar, Build Back Better versus Build Back the Same. And today's conversation will be looking at how will we know our recovery projects are not just repeating the past, and does it matter? So we'll be hearing today from Robert Prestipino and Michael Campbell around current trends and insights emerging in developing investment attractive recovery projects that enhance local lifestyle and support sustainable employment. The purpose of this session is to help explore the direct impacts of COVID-19 on developing and implementing economic development projects in regional, rural and remote Australia. The session will cover, is there really a new normal? Where do you find the best ideas for recovery projects? And how do you know that your recovery project will make a difference? I've just got some housekeeping matters to draw your attention to at the moment. Firstly, because of numbers in the webinar format, people are unable to directly speak to the presenters. However, there's a chat and a Q&A down the bottom, and people are encouraged to use those. The other thing is that there'll be a video there. This is being recorded, and there'll be a video available on Friday or Monday, and we'll email out to everyone the link to that. Because it's more of a conversation between Robert and Michael, there is the opportunity for you to click on the top right-hand corner where it says View, and click Gallery, and then you'll be able to see Robert and Michael conversing with each other. So I think that just about covers it. Welcome everyone, and I now pass over to Robert.
Thanks, Kate, and welcome everyone. Thank you for attending today. I thought I'd quickly just give her a structure of what we're doing, because we're always innovating and trying to do something a little bit different here in the SEGRA community. Firstly, I'll be setting a little bit of context for our conversation today about recovery projects and I suppose where it's been since COVID started. Also, we've integrated, there's only 3 interactive polls, so it's a big experiment today to get you engaged with some simple questions. So we'll be just setting those up as we go through. And basically, we'll be talking at the front end a bit about the problem, what actually is, the new normal, or is it the new normal? And then we'll be probably unpacking some of the ideas around solutions, the way to think about it. And of course, be looking at any sort of Q&A and chat as we go along. But what I'd like to do first is, in setting the context, is I'll just pull up the screen. Because some of you may be aware that in March of last year, we started a series when COVID hit around this notion. We're all back there wondering about what is the metaphor that was used, what is the bridge we're going to build into the post-pandemic regional Australia, the sort of 2.0 version. And way back then, it was very much, we knew we would come out of this at some point and there would be a recovery task. And back in around March, it was very much trying to have a sense of what is or what isn't part of what might be that conversation. So what happened over that period, and we will drop the link for this map in the chat for you to look at later, but it was effectively the outcome of a whole lot of discussions we had through March to May, where we collated a lot of insights across a number of sectors. We had about 18 conversations, and it captured about, across that chart, there's about 65 sort of insights of what the various sectors in regional Australia thought would be important in coming out as in the recovery phase. Now, what's really interesting since then that, you know, at the end of that, towards the end of last year, some of the summary points was say, well, there seem to be threads about collaboration, customer focus, place-based, identity, seem to be common threads in all the sort of sectors we were talking about. And there was a sense of urgency about whatever we need to do in recovery, we need to move fast, but with the right project, whatever that meant at the time. So all that, the conversation finished in about the first 3 months. And it's been about 7 months since then about all of us, I think, watching as things have unfolded. And now we're sitting here in February, and I think there's a real sense of maybe the bridge, the mist is sort of lifting a bit, and we're beginning to see maybe what is the pathway, what might be the real challenges of, you know, post-pandemic regional Australia. So we thought we'd have a conversation today and early in the year and start teasing that out. And we'll be looking at some of the insights that Michael brings to it as well, and his travels. So as part of that notion, we're sitting here in this looking at the idea of building back better, and it's even interesting how Boris in the UK has taken that further. You know, build back better, greener and faster. So there is this emerging conversation, I think, about what that might actually mean and what that might mean for regional Australia. So what I'm going to do is just part of setting up the interactive poll. We've got a very simple question, but it's a little bit of setup to how we need you to get to the site to be part of the 3 questions today. And I'll just pull the screen up just a second to explain the process. What we'll be doing, I'll pull this up, we'll be asking you to find your way to this site, and just remember this, when you get to this website, near the top is where you enter a code. Now, how to get there is really here. If you go to, there's a couple of things. If you're on a PC and you have your mobile phone, you could scan the QR code and it'll take you to the site, and you simply put in that number in that top bar, 22252, and that'll get you into our active polls for today. Or if you're on the PC, just type in slido.com. That'll get you that web page I showed you. And again, punch in the number 22252. Because what we'll do, I'll activate this first poll, and what you'll have there is a question that you can simply answer how you feel right at the moment, heading off into the year and looking across that bridge in the post to our sort of regional Australia. How confident are you that we will build back better? And this is just drop your thoughts in there, and we'll just get a feel of where people are sitting at right at the moment before we get into the session. I'll give you a little bit of time for those finding their way to the site, because we've got a couple of more interesting questions a bit later on, but sort of once you're there, those polls will come up and it'll be very easy to get to. Well, looking at that, it's interesting. We've got a lot of very confident people here today, which isn't a bad thing at all. I mean, it's very optimistic for regional Australia. So, and with a moderately confident sort of shooting through. So I'll just leave that there. That poll will be operating in the background. I'll come back to stop share. And really just, I'm going to throw a question to Michael now, in the sense that with his networks, and Michael, I mean, with your national and international context and the space you work in, what's appearing this year as the impacts of COVID, and particularly for regional recovery projects? What are some of the trends and conversations you're seeing happening?
I think probably the biggest thing would be that when all of this started in March and April, and if you think back to that time, we had these long lines forming outside of Centrelink's around the country. You had Centrelink website crashing multiple times because of all the people, and I think really did create quite a significant amount of angst and fear about the future, and specifically about the economy. Um, Moving forward, the stock market crash, all of these sorts of things, and was in the media constantly. And I think now, as we're sort of progressing on the backside of this, and vaccinations are taking place finally in this country, but also, progressing quite well in the U.S. and U.K. and others. I think we've seen that it's just not as bad as we thought it was going to be. And I think that a lot of reason for that is the foundations. While we weren't probably in pre-COVID on the best sort of economic foundations, but the pandemic was a man-made sort of phenomenon. The lockdowns and things like that. It wasn't similar to the Great Depression, where there were some fundamentals that were quite shaky and unstable to begin with. And so, because of all of that, we were better set to bounce back quite strongly. And I think in terms of regional Australia, because we've had the international borders closed on us, they're going to remain closed for most of the year. We've had state borders closed. Everyone we talk to in regional Australia has just seen record numbers of tourists and visitors and people coming out from the cities and exploring their own backyards. And so I think that's been very positive in many respects for regional Australia. If we think a bit more broadly about it, I think the way that this has really changed things, comes down to a couple different avenues. And the first is about how we interact with each other. Social distancing and the measures that have come into play, I don't think that they're actually going to go anywhere in the near future. Even after we get vaccinated, I think a lot of those social distancing protocols will be maintained. And there's thoughts coming out of the U.S. in particular now about how do we redesign, our public open space to account for social distancing, to provide hygiene and sanitation stations and those sort of things. And if you go to think through about not just open space, but museums, theaters, all of those sort of community infrastructure that we have around the country, how do we actually re-engineer all of that to account for social distancing? It's something that they're thinking about in the United States in particular, and even going so far as how do we redesign our public transport nodes? And not just thinking about the airports, which have sort of already been, redesigned, even though much of that's temporary, but think about train stations, think about bus stations, bus depots, all these areas where we do have people mingling, and particularly across the public transport system. So I think, that change to society almost is something that will be here, for the foreseeable future. Together with that, the way that we work, there's numbers now, depending on what sort of surveys you look at from corporate real estate companies or others, that show that 15 to 30% of office workers in the CBD are not going to return. A lot of the big multinationals are really seriously thinking about how they rejig, their actual office space. And there may or may not be a net decline in demand, but the warm human bodies working in that space, I think we will see a net decline, and we'll see a lot more of the working from home continue as we move forward. And of course, that has the added benefit that many people in many professions have realized they actually don't need to be near the city at all. And so that's really boosted. There was an article that came out again today, really showing about this property boom in many regional areas, particularly coastal and the tourism areas that we have, where they're seeing people snap up houses now and really see property prices climb quite strongly, to the point we haven't really seen that previously. And so when we move away from sort of the community and sort of regional aspects, I think the big change is around how we evaluate risk. And I think this really comes down to what sort of business or what sort of industry any particular business would be in. If you're a cafe owner, when you're making the big order for the weekend on the Wednesday or the Thursday to arrive on Thursday or Friday, you got to be thinking, okay, is there a chance we're going to go into a snap lockdown? We've seen this pop up in WA and Queensland and other places. And that really does cause, that's money. That's stock that oftentimes you can't hold throughout the weekend, or if so, you'd be throwing a big chunk of it out. Similarly, if you're in the hotel business, there's a whole nother level of risk now we're going to be looking at if we're going to be thinking about investing in a hotel in Cairns, or Broome, or wherever we might be. The fact that lockdowns and travel restrictions can happen, can pop up, can be very sudden, and can be very dramatic, has to overlay another level of risk here. And now what that means, of course, is that people will still invest in accommodation assets and things, but it's that other layer of complexity where we're going to need that much more of a return from that asset to account for that risk. And so, I think this will play out in the fact that, particularly across regional areas, we may not see that traditional sort of hotel development as much as we've seen previously. There wasn't a whole lot of it to begin with, but what we'll see is more niche style type of investments in that space, something that can be a bit smaller, that can actually accommodate for some of that potential risk and movement moving forward. The other thing is we think about manufacturing and globalization, really, where a lot of companies had a lot of different parts and a lot of things manufactured, particularly in China. And we had these very sophisticated on-time global supply chains, and they were horribly disrupted through all of the pandemic. Firstly, in China, when they went through their lockdown, where factories literally shut down for days and weeks, on through to the subsequent shutdowns in other countries and other restrictions on trade and boats and things coming from overseas. And I know particularly around the healthcare industry and in Australia here, that's something where we've already seen movements around greater manufacturing capability for PPE, healthcare products, machines. Saw lots of companies diversify from distilling rum to making hand sanitizer and other sorts of things. So I think a lot of those big corporates are really starting to evaluate those supply chains in the same way that investors would be considering risk in hotels. It's the risk that supply chain is actually going to be disrupted. If you look at the United States in particular, it was quite I think a very interesting phenomenon that as the pandemic really took hold, inquiries for manufacturing space, for distribution space across the United States, across the Rust Belt, in areas that hadn't seen that level of interest in manufacturing in many, many years, it really exploded. And you keep in mind this is also during the Chinese and U.S. sort of tariff war, so there were some other things going on that factored into that. But this supply chain issue certainly was another part of that. Talking to guys back over in the States and clear across the country, everyone was actually really, really busy during the pandemic. Either working with their Main Street businesses and trying to keep them afloat, or just that manufacturing and the industrial sort of supply chain and businesses involved in that clear across the United States in particular. And so I think that supply chain question is something that will be looked at over the subsequent years, and businesses will be putting in their own strategies and investments to deal with that elevated level of risk. So I think it comes down to, again, how we sort of interact as a society, where we go, where we want to live, how we work, and then also just in terms of that level of risk, be that around supply chains or be that around, businesses that are heavily exposed to international and domestic borders and visitation.
Yeah, look, there's a couple of points that you raised early on, and I know the impact on physical design. I think we might actually underestimate how permanent that'll be, because I've been having some conversations. There's some PhD students at Deakin University that have actually looked at that and found the evidence that, from the Great Plague or the Spanish flu, the impact, it changed urban form, it changed requirements. It basically created open space, different type of living to counteract the infection. And I think you're right about social distancing. It's probably going to be one of the profound physical design changes that'll be permanent as part of creating our urban communities more resilient. And not only, I think the physical form, as you're outlined, there's a lot of discussion about airflow in buildings. You can see a lot of minimum standards now that'll be about the sense of healthy airflow, which probably is all great for our own lifestyle and well-being. So definitely I see in the physical design side, you're right. I think there's going to be some really profound urban design and project design changes to de-risk and provide resilience. The other thing too, I think, the point you made about supply chain and the breaking of that is profound. And it's interesting how it's in heightening local lifestyle, local amenity, local values, even down to local food production. A lot of those things existed before pre-COVID, and I know we've talked a bit about this. COVID's almost just really the accelerator for stuff that we were addressing before, but we probably now realise how critically important it is moving forward. So that part of place-based lifestyle and mobility, and again, I suppose for all of us looking at projects now, we're just trying to understand where that pendulum will swing back, because we know there's a bit of a knee-jerk response. And I wouldn't mind your thoughts on that too, because there are some conversation around, oh yeah, all these people have moved to the regions, but they don't get pretty bored with it and they want to move back to the cities. What are your thoughts about that view?
Yeah, look, that certainly could happen. And I know from talking to, people on the South Coast and parts of Queensland that, a lot of those property purchases that, they may be still very much more a holiday home as opposed to a permanent residence. People may be downsizing, from the metropolitan house, buying the holiday home and buying the unit in the city, so that they'll still spend that some time in the city, but being able to work more from home allows them to spend more time, at the holiday property as well. But as you said, a lot of these trends were in existence before COVID, and I think really the ones that have been tipped over the edge here are those that could have always, taken advantage of technology and moved to a region long ago, but just, there was that personal perception, or, that one little thing stopping them, and COVID just, pushed them over the edge, so to speak. But I don't think that, this is going to result in, a tsunami type of effect. Now, that being said, we have seen in the first time since the early 1900s, net declines in metropolitan populations. But you need to also unpack that. That is the result of people leaving the capital cities and moving out to regional areas. But the biggest factor on why those populations in capital cities have gone backwards, and I think the number off the top of my head was somewhere around 300,000 people across the country. We're not having any international migration right now. And the international migration to capital cities was always one of the really big drivers of the population growth in those capital cities. So I think the people that do go out to regions, most of the people I talk to who have relocated, they're really happy. They went out for all the right sort of reasons, and they tend to be very, very happy with it. We do know and hear stories all the time from clients about, the family moving out to the region. The husband or wife has a job that's, kind of predicated that move, and the other partner struggles to find work or struggles to fit in, and then that triggers, that sort of population churn. And I think some of those things will inevitably, still go on. But I think regional Australia has never been in a better position to try to capture some of that population growth across the country than where we sit right now.
So, Michael, sort of in conclusion of this topic, then, what do you think the problem we're really solving with our recovery projects? Is it that much different to what we were looking to do pre-COVID? What are your thoughts?
I mean, I don't think so, really. When you look across the regions, the foundations you would have, the key drivers for any project, be it community infrastructure or other hard or soft infrastructure that can be directly related to business, that the airport expansion, the wharf, the port, all that sort of stuff. It's always got to be built on strong foundations and strong economics and drivers. And once we build up those sort of projects, the critical missing link is always that bit of capital, whether we're talking about a new facility or, again, another piece of infrastructure. And that's always been the basis, for why we needed that government intervention from the state or Commonwealth. And if you look at all the funding programs that have come out, and there will be more, in terms of COVID-related recovery, it'll go back to it. And I think it's actually interesting to think back. We've been through drought and horrible drought in many parts of this country, and some are still in that horrible drought. And when you started looking at some of the drought funding that was coming out, particularly from the Commonwealth, it was heavily geared towards, that diversification of the economy. How do we diversify the economy so we're not as reliant upon the agriculture, and therefore not as reliant or as adversely impacted by drought? And we think about a COVID recovery thing, I think those will be the common themes that'll come out as well. How are we diversifying our tourism mix away from international? If because of COVID and those international border restrictions, to make us less reliant on that visitor cohort, and therefore less impacted if there's ever a future global pandemic and international borders have to shut again. So I think it'll be that unique sort of nuance and then just that perspective that gets put onto the any said sort of project. And as you said, with the changing design nature of public open space and community infrastructure related to social distancing, that'll just be that other layer that comes across. But again, the foundation and structure for those projects is always the same. We're trying to improve livability. We're trying to improve amenity. Get people out and about, exercise, more physical activity, less cars, more walking, more biking, all of those sorts of things. And again, they all existed before COVID, and so it's just about the manner of perspective that we really apply to through that COVID lens on how or why that's more important today than what it has been. Mm-hmm. And I think again we sort of glanced over it, and I think we do glance over it every day. But we are very, very fortunate in this country that by almost every account we're almost back to normal. Where I was talking to a colleague last week in Germany, and she's been locked in an apartment for the greater part of a year. And her saving grace is she gets to walk around the old part of the city every now and again. Parts of the United States, were hit hard by COVID, and then these winter storms, particularly across Texas and other things. So I think the other thing is we are very, very fortunate, and that impact of COVID has not been as severe or significant here as it has been in Europe and the United States and other parts of the world.
Yeah, I suppose then in summary of this section, it seems that maybe the nuance here is just having a bit more time to be a bit more strategic, a bit more layered in the solution to accommodate those nuances you're talking about. So maybe the real value add for having great recovery projects is spending that little bit extra time at the front end to understand the positioning and the response, because it's just almost building on what we were doing before, but clearly the need to do it just a little bit smarter to be nuanced to where we're heading. Yeah, now's the time for our next poll. For those of you that were able to find your way to it, this is going to be a bit more interesting for you to participate in. We'll bring it, I'll just bring it up here, poll number 2. It's really, it's going to create a word cloud. If you could drop in there the notion of what do you see as the top 3 challenges facing recovery projects as we're moving forward, and the projects you're involved in or aware about, what do you think would be the top 3 challenges they would need to fundamentally address? So if you could find your way across to slido.com and put those numbers in, and you can put in as many responses as you like here. There's, I think, a 25-character limit on it. So certainly give us your thoughts about the top 3 challenges for a recovery project, and we'll just see where people are thinking. I'll just give that a few minutes. And already, probably unsurprisingly, for all of us who work in the regions, it's ideas are great, but we've got to find funding, which is a bit of a theme of what Michael was talking about earlier about risk de-risking and stuff. So look, that's great. I'll keep that open. So please, as we're moving on, and any thoughts in there you have about what you see as the top 3 challenges, please drop them into that page, and we'll see how that evolves by the end of the session. So some good stuff happening. I'll just come back now. And remember, please keep dropping stuff in there if we've got things to say. Great, because what this part of the discussion, I want to sort of tease Michael's brain out now about what actually might be the success factors of a good recovery project. I mean, we've sort of identified some of those challenges, but if we're working on them out there, what might they actually look like to basically succeed? And I think a lot's probably off that thing you raised earlier, Michael, about risk, de-risking, investment attraction. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
I mean, again, I think for things like this, the foundations, the fundamentals are really critical here. And if we're talking specifically about things like building better regions or bushfire local economic recovery funds and all these sorts of things that tend to roll out from time to time, and again, I do believe there'll be more, particularly around the tourism industry. It really comes down to the fundamentals, and I mean, I think the thing we work with clients on a lot is try to put yourself in the space of the assessor and what the government's trying to achieve. Okay, and obviously with these funds, they want to achieve as much bang for buck as they can. And so fundamentals, when I say strong fundamentals for a project, we need to be able to see clear demand, a clear need for whatever the infrastructure is. And that clear demand or need can be demonstrated in a number of ways. We can demonstrate it as there's a problem, there's a bottleneck, there's a break here in the infrastructure that doesn't allow our economy to grow. So if we remove that bottleneck, we improve the infrastructure, this pent up demand, this pent up need can flow. The other side of the coin is just the growing market demand. That we know certain trends were happening before COVID and have actually expedited since. Nature-based tourism, mountain biking, trekking, all of those sorts of things. There's growing market trends across a number of different sources to demonstrate there's plenty of demand. And so, that aspect of the fundamental is the need, the demand, being able to clearly demonstrate that is there. The next fundamental for a lot of these funding programs is that the solution we're proposing will work. And typically here there's going to be a dollar figure, as the poll just indicated, the funding dollar figure is going to be there. And so you want to show that here's the problem, here's our solution, and it's going to work. So, when we think about those fundamentals, it needs to be long term. We need to demonstrate that whatever thing we're doing is going to be there for the long term. It's going to deliver long term benefits. And also we're going to be able to maintain that, if it is an asset in particular, and often it is, that needs maintaining, we need to show that we can do that. So oftentimes the financial aspects of the project need to stack up very much the same way that they would for any private investor. They're seeking a return. They need those financial parameters to stack up. And when we're thinking about infrastructure funding, particularly from government sources and government funds, the same holds true. It's not necessarily a return on investment, of course, that the government's looking for. It's they want to make sure the asset, once they give the money, if they do, that the asset's going to be able to be maintained and hopefully self-sufficient in a financial sense. The library is the quintessential sort of community infrastructure that really struggles in all these things. Libraries don't make money. They've never, ever made money. So again, it comes down to how are we going to maintain that asset? And then, of course, what the government's really looking for out of any recovery project, any recovery fund, is they're looking for jobs. They're looking for evidence that the said thing we want to do, the solution to the problem, the infrastructure we're proposing that gets funded, that it's going to demonstrate some real and tangible economic benefits on the ground. And this can be demonstrated in terms of jobs. This can be demonstrated in terms of, unlocking potential for a local supply chain, because the port or the cruise ship terminal or whatever the thing might be has limited capacity. We can't increase turnover for local businesses, or whatever those infrastructure things may be. And so thinking about it in terms of how does it produce jobs? How does it produce revenue and expenditure in the local economy? How does it generate the opportunity for new businesses or for business expansion? And again, thinking through all of these things, the other fundamental, the final one, is just around risk. It's sad but true, I think, to really be thinking about these things, is that the government does weigh risk over top of all the projects through all these recovery funds. And that's demonstrated through the amount of paperwork they now require for people to access these funds. It's all about risk mitigation from a government perspective. And so, through that, there's a number of different ways to do that, to demonstrate, lower levels of risk. And particularly if we're trying to look at demonstrating economic benefit, having support letters from a company, I will invest X, I will create X jobs if that piece of infrastructure is there. That's sort of the ultimate ability to be able to really de-risk it. And at the end of the day, unfortunately, too, I think the best strategy comes from surmising all of that And so really, again, going back to all of those fundamentals, demonstrating the clear need and demand, the fact we have the right solution, the fact it's going to be self-sustaining, the asset will be maintained, and we're going to be maximizing, economic benefits. And diversification of the economy can also be one of those clear benefits. And you've seen that in some of the criteria for recent funds in New South Wales and WA in particular. But also still comes down to the old fundamental. Again, the government's not looking for a return on investment, so to speak, like a typical investor would. But if we're demonstrating the ability to create 100 jobs from an infrastructure project that costs $1 million, and that's going to be compared to other projects that generate 10 or 20 or 30 jobs from infrastructure that cost $4 or $5 million, there's a clear bigger bang for buck for the government with the $1 million expenditure to create 100 jobs. And so I think trying to, again, understand all of this from the perspective of the government and what they're looking to achieve through those funds. But again, those fundamentals of having and being able to prove, having evidence that can demonstrate there is demand and need. We do have the right solution. It's adequately costed. We can maintain and take care of the asset. And we know that these tangible economic benefits, will flow from the project. All of those things matter just as much today as they did last year, as they did the year before that. And as you mentioned before, I think with if you look at the BBRF program that's out right now, there's a heavy bent on tourism, and that's reacting to the significant impacts that the tourism industry has felt from COVID. And so it's going to be using all of those fundamentals, but then overlay that the perspective of the government for the here and now. And in terms of COVID recovery, and I do think there'll be initiatives, particularly from the Queensland government in particular, but also perhaps others, in terms of additional funding rounds for the tourism industry, given that significant negative impact that they felt. And so it's about putting those fundamentals, but then actually portraying that through that perspective of economic recovery from COVID.
Yeah, Michael, I wonder about those proponents that are really trying to get their head around the economic transformation, sustainable employment, particularly in the regions. We know we're needing to move to new skills, new industries. Circular economy's got some opportunities in it. But I just wonder, because in the past, if we're putting these projects together and even looking at employment, it seems these more resilient projects are going to be a bit more complex. They're not as much as, quantifying jobs out of a farm or a hole in the ground, or just one commercial entity. I mean, if it seems moving forward, the economy and businesses will be more interconnected, resource energy sharing, maybe skill sharing. I just wonder if we're positioning projects, is there a bit more thought, or how do we not fall into the trap of sort of thinking the old economy, which is fairly siloed, business case development and employment projection? How do we bring that in more intentionally into our projects?
Look, I think because something's a bit more complex that way, we still have ways and means of demonstrating those economic benefits. Was talking to a client just yesterday on a project, and it actually is not going to, in its own right, it's not going to create a single new job. But what the project does do is it allows the community, the organization, and others that are attached to it to forego and avoid a whole lot of costs. And so we're actually generating benefit, not necessarily in that typical way of new jobs, but we're generating benefit in cost savings. And because we have cost savings, we can be more productive. Those savings can be put to other uses. And so, one of them in particular that I know is a big issue in lots of places was around freight. And this happens to be a very, very remote community, but they spend a lot of money on shipping stuff out to the community. And by being able to amalgamate that supply, their cost of shipping goes down just dramatically. And those cost savings mean we have more money now to dedicate to other programs, other projects, those sorts of things. In terms of the circular economy, there's another project we're working on now that really, I guess, embraces that on numerous fronts around food and beverage manufacturing. And it's around using the waste product of one as an input to another, being able to share heat that may come off of one process and then may be able to be channeled into another. Wastewater that can be used across in different processes. Now that project is also going to be heavily tied to local agricultural production. And so again, we can take spent material from the food processing, beverage processing sector, and then put that out as feed and fodder for livestock. And so we do start creating these things. But again, that all comes back to cost savings, increased productivity. And so we can still go through and identify metrics where we can talk in the traditional terms of jobs, of dollars, flowing back into the economy. And so I think, again, as you'll tell with me, it always comes down to these fundamentals, and the way we get to the fundamental, that may change from project to project. But being able to demonstrate, because again, we can talk about with this food and beverage precinct, we can talk about resource sharing and how all that goes, but if we can't communicate that into jobs and dollars, it's just not going to be as compelling as it could be, particularly when we actually do need to go ask the government for whatever sort of funding it might be to unlock, that single opportunity. So the ability to turn that into dollars and jobs, again, puts us in the traditional speak, as it were, for many politicians, they want to stand up and announce jobs. They want to stand up and announce those sort of things. And so whatever avenues we have to sort of navigate to help clients, get to that point. But it's very important to transition those things, particularly from the new economy into that traditional language of jobs and expenditure.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Actually, that's probably a good segue into our final little interactive poll we put up here, because we're talking a bit about.
Still curious to see how the last one ended up.
It's up there on the screen.
There you go.
Not a bad. It's a great insight to the real issues, sort of reinforcing what you're saying, Michael. Poll number 3 from the audience is really interesting, because I just really today would like to know, well, what you guys would think are the key outcomes for a successful recovery project. I mean, what would it need to deliver from your perspective to be fundamentally successful? And again, this is just another word cloud. Drop in as many thoughts as you like, whether it's the top 3 factors. But it's basically that. What would make a recovery project a success in your eyes? So just throw your thoughts in there. We'll create a word cloud. And again, Michael, I think you've been reading the minds of the audience. Okay, well, and again, I'll leave that open and live for people to keep putting stuff into, because I'd just like to come back now and for us to try and, I suppose, wind a few things up. And certainly if there's any questions and that people would like either of us to respond to, please drop them in the Q&A. Because I suppose coming back to the original idea of today, which really was just to start a conversation as we're moving towards this bridge to recovery. And I think, as Michael has alluded to, the world and everyone's getting, I think, probably a much clearer picture of what is the landscape, the recovery landscape. And I must admit, with my conversations with Michael over the days and that in preparing for today, it's been interesting that it's become much clearer that the new normal or post-recovery really isn't that different. And COVID, yet again, has just been that accelerator of critical issues. And it seems that the really good recovery projects moving forward, as Michael has said, will be fundamentally based on the important things we were trying to do before recovery. But I think there is, it seems there's a bit more layering of outcomes, and quantifying and de-risking is a little bit more sophisticated. But I think the world with supply chains changing, we're getting more into ecosystems, networks and collaboration. So that seems to be part of the new landscape in ideas and how you might work towards de-risking them. And also just that whole notion of needing to move fairly quickly and working out what the key projects this year might be. Michael, I wouldn't mind throwing to you sort of in summary, is there anything you'd like to say? Because I think there are few questions coming, but your thoughts on the topic.
Yeah, well, I think you're spot on. I think things haven't really changed that, fundamentally that much. But I also think at the same time that, regional Australia has never been in a better place, to benefit from some of these potentially changing trends. The acceleration of people moving out from metropolitan areas, utilizing technology, in terms of working from wherever they want. I mean, if we go back, I always find it's interesting to look back sometimes. And there's a guy named Richard Florida, and he wrote a book called The Creative Class way back, I think it was the early 2000s. And the premise really was that due to technology, the high knowledge workers, the high knowledge workforce, it has the ability, or they have the ability to choose where they want to live first, and then they can get the job and work from anywhere. And now that really didn't quite take off, I think, the way he was proposing, and we've seen greater evidence over the last 5 years that that trend is, perhaps starting to emerge. But if we think back to that ability, COVID's proven that can work, without a shadow of a doubt, that can work. And so again, I think, it's possibly just accelerated those trends for regional Australia, but we've never been in a better position. A lot of the communities I've been traveling to, they've had the best February and the best January they've ever had. And typically it's been a really bad month. So again, I think with all those travel restrictions, we do have, a really good opportunity the next 6, 12, 18 months to really try to make some significant strides moving forward in regional Australia.
Yes, and I was just looking at some of the comments in the chat there about, and the fragility about the drought and bushfires, which we can't really forget, as they were, profound impacts just prior to COVID. And yet again, I suppose, look what's happened in Western Australia recently with fires too. They're part of that climate change challenge, devastating challenge in front of us. I think, as a comment alludes to, I think that the communities are probably a bit more fragile, even though they weren't impacted with COVID. What are your thoughts about that? Because, if we take that COVID out, there are some significant issues there we still haven't recovered from that clearly factor into recovery projects. What are your thoughts around that?
Well, I mean, we've been doing work in many of the bushfire affected areas, particularly down along the south coast and a lot of the communities there and elsewhere. And if you go and talk to the businesses in those areas, COVID just wasn't anything. I mean, the severity of the bushfires and the longevity of those impacts are going to be very much more severe than anything COVID could have ever delivered. And I think without COVID, the bushfire recovery effort would have been a lot swifter, would have been a lot more efficient. COVID swooped in and sort of took over the media headlines, which meant it took over the attention of all politicians, which meant, the bushfire recovery, I think, got pushed aside. It's was it $5 or $6 billion that the Prime Minister put into the Bushfire Recovery Authority. It took a year, almost a year, for that money to flow through in the state of New South Wales to the Bushfire Local Economic Recovery Fund. That fund has now closed, and that money still hasn't been spent. It'll probably be June before the decision comes out, and then after that, when the money actually starts flowing. So look, I think the bushfires and the COVID pandemic does show that fragility that many communities have, that we as human beings have, particularly as it comes to this virus, and now the additional strains that have been created, or more from COVID. So I think there is that resilience to a degree, yes, but also that apprehension we may have about our future, because of the uncertainty around the changing climate, around drought, around bushfire, around epidemics. They all sort of total to just create a very uncertain future for all of us.
Yeah, it seems that, in that context, probably the next, I suppose, 12 or 24 months about what projects or recovery projects are funded are probably going to be really critical to being, I suppose, comprehensive enough to respond to, as you've said, the big issues that existed before COVID, and then trying to anticipate. And as we've said today, there are issues that COVID's impacted on that's changing the sort of landscape, the business environment, even the risk structure. So there's probably a worthy time for people to pause and develop ideas, I suppose, and stress test the recovery project ideas. Particularly, we're just, as I said, early in the phase, it's only February. And there's actually one question, because we're coming to really conclusion of today, and Kate's a tough taskmaster. If anyone who's been to SEGRA knows about time control, so we've only got a few minutes left before she swoops in. But I just got a question to the audience. You know, Mike and I have been chatting about things, and I've been thinking about, you know, whether there is any interest in the community to maybe have a smaller sort of group or Zoom meeting sessions to stress test ideas, share ideas around projects, and maybe even hot seat ideas around, because it's sort of the sense, you know, two heads are better than one. And if there's any appetite for people to be part of maybe a small sort of masterclass discussion, mastermind, really. It's not as if anyone knows all the answers. So we're keen to find out if there's a bit of interest there, because we'd be happy to facilitate a few sessions and see where it leads up. You know, obviously be a small group, and I think we'd want to set it up as more like a Zoom meeting. So for those people who truly want to, you know, ask some questions and test some ideas, what are the thoughts? If there's any yeses, drop a few in the chat box to give us a little bit of feedback. I can see a couple there, which is great. I think we might work out something there, Michael.
Sure, happy to.
No, that's good. Well, look, okay. I will, since we're running a couple of minutes early, if there's no questions or comments, we've got a little bit of time if anyone in the audience wants to make a comment or ask a question before Kate wraps it up. So looks like we're all pretty good. I might, I'll just quickly flick back to your last question. Actually, you guys have locked in, we'll actually see the outcome of that, because it's live, still live, which is good. Okay, Kate, I'll hand it back to you.
Look, thanks very much, Robert, and thank you to both of you, Robert and Michael, for that conversation today, which was very interesting. And I thank you very much. As I said, it's being recorded, and so people will be able to go back if there are particular things that they want to reference. Now, I've just, Robert and Michael have been very shy about promoting their expertise in this subject and the authority that they have. And I know I put out the bios in the initial invitation, but between them, they have more than 50 years experience in urban design and planning and economic development. And I've taken the liberty of putting both their email addresses up on the website in the chat box. Now, Michael, can you just check yours is correct? So that if you know, you're wanting to take that further, or you have an interest that might be related to your own region, please don't hesitate to contact either of them. Look, thank you again very much for your presentations, and thank you everyone who's participated. And we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Thank you very much.